demand what has to happen for us. I think it is absolutely important. It is critical for our development. We have a tendency to fall into a state of relaxation when you think that you have a government who is presumably going to protect your interests, and you leave in place the avenues that led to your exploitation before, and you leave those avenues unattended. And God forbid, should your fortunes change, you're left in the same position, or perhaps in a worse position than you were before. And at that stage, you have nobody else but yourself to blame, or we would have nobody else but ourselves to blame if we find ourselves in that position again, having had an opportunity to change the structure so that we could not be taken advantage of again and we don't. So that is the aspect that I intend to concentrate on today. Article 9 of our Constitution says that sovereignty belongs to the people who exercise it through their representatives and the democratic organs established by and under the Constitution. Great words, great philosophy. We'll address that in a bit. Article 13 of the Constitution says, the principal objective of the political system of the state is to establish an inclusionary democracy by providing increasing opportunities for the participation of the citizens and their organizations in the management and decision-making processes of the state, with particular emphasis on those areas of decision-making that directly affect their well-being. And the village can get closer to your well-being. And that is beautifully articulated. I will tell you two things about those two sections, or those two articles of the Constitution. They are not justiciable. And what that means is that you can't take the state to court for having breached them. So they are essentially declaratory provisions, but unenforceable in reality. So if you are not afforded an opportunity to participate in a decision that will directly affect you, you cannot actually take the state to court under those two articles. Recently in the CCJ, there has been a shift in that position that says that it establishes the underlying philosophy. But unlike, for example, your right to private property or your right to due process, which are justiciable, you can take the state to court for that. Those two articles, which are beautifully articulated, are not justiciable, and we need, whenever we consider changing the Constitution, which personally I think is urgent, to make those articles justiciable so that you can take the state to court, whoever is in government, to ensure that you participate in the decision-making process. What is the relationship between the poor and the decision-making process? At the national level, we have no constituency representation. So if I were to ask you who is the representative for Buxton in the National Assembly, you would be unable to say who that is simply because you don't actually vote for a representative for Buxton. So even if David might be ideologically the representative, the reality is we know he's not in Parliament. If he was in Parliament, there is no constituency system, which means it is up to the leader of the list to decide if and when he will put a representative for Buxton from his party list in the Parliament. So at the national level, there's no constituency representation. Two, no one, including the poor, is able to directly elect a representative to the National Assembly. So not a single part of this country can you say you have a parliamentary representative for your constituency or your community. You can do that at a local government election level, but it certainly can't happen at the national level. Three, it is up to the party to assign a member as representative for a particular community or district. The problem with that is that you don't identify who that person is. Only one person gets to do that, and that is the person who's head of the list. And as we go forward, you will see that the head of the list also has the power of God to put you in National Assembly, and he has the power of God to remove you. And we've had one member of Parliament in a previous House, in a previous sitting of Parliament, I believe it might have been the 8th sitting. He was a member of the People's National Congress, that is Mr. James McAllister, bright young man, engineer, who was actually recalled because his views were not consistent with the views of the leadership. And that is one of the difficulties that you have under our present system. So when we go forward and we talk about the abundance, we have to make sure that we have the capacity to control the people who are going to make the decisions or pretend to make the decisions on our behalf. the leader of the list determines who sits in the National Assembly. In the last election, what actually happened with the combination between APNU and the AFC was that they put that decision-making process, or the leader of the list came from neither party, and they picked two persons from civil society, Professor Lutchman and Ms. Jean LaRose as leader and deputy leader, respectively. It was a progressive development, but that's not technically what the list allows. So if there's a party leader, that party leader makes the determination who sits in Parliament, and that is why after Parliament, for the first 4 to 5 days, there's a lot of jockeying in party headquarters to find out who will actually go to Parliament, and people get upset, some people are elated, of course, because it becomes a decision. In a truly democratic system, you would have elected your MP, you would have known who your MP is from campaign stage, and if you are dissatisfied with the way she or he performs, you can remove them. That's not possible under our present system. The relationship between the poor and the decision-making process continued. Party representatives in the National Assembly owe their existence and continued presence in the National Assembly to the leader of the list and not the electorate. So think about it. If the boss has the power to take me out of Parliament, then as much as I love you and as much as I'm committed to you and I talk about your development, when I weigh the boss removing me from my duty-free against you getting upset with me, you know where the decision is likely to end up, right? And the incentive regime is to satisfy the leader of the list as opposed to the interest of the constituency. What is the relationship between, at the local government level, fortunately, it is different. At the local government level, the position is better than the national level. The community can directly elect its representatives to, if it's in the city, to the city council, or to the town council if it's one of the towns, or to the NDC. And the local government organs are invariably, at the end of the day, unfortunately, financially dependent on central government for funding. So again, he who pays the piper calls the tune. There are very few cities. Georgetown, as you know, is unable to finance itself. It has the best tax base of all the constituencies, all the NDCs, city council, and town councils in the country. The largest possible tax base. It's where all the richest companies in the country operate, and if they cannot manage on their own, they cannot balance their budget, and that's our biggest. They all have to go to central government. Then you can imagine the communities that are much smaller, far more remote. It's going to be virtually impossible for them to sustain themselves. If you have a community, for example, that does not have an agricultural base, that is very, very small, and the residents are economically challenged, there's no way that NDC is going to be able to generate enough income from that community to sustain itself. So even though at the local government level, we have a different system where you can directly elect an independent member or your own constituent representative, again, they have to go to central government. And central government, whoever is there, of course, will leverage some power. And of course, the final point is that central government makes the budgetary allocations to the various communities. And under our system, you can well imagine what happens. The government of the day that is in office, of course, is going to allocate more resources to the places that are voter-rich for them. This is the same theme that continues, and I speak about various aspects of it. Now, what happens here is that when we start to talk about oil and gas, a very, very important decision is where you are going to locate the shore base. Now, the shore base is basically the wharf facilities from which all the equipment and resources are shipped from the land to the offshore rig. Right now, 80 to 90% of those resources are shipped out to Chagaramas in Trinidad because they've got the existing facilities, and we don't here in Guyana. But the decision to locate the shore base, as you can imagine in Guyana, is going to become very important. And unless you rely on the data, it is going to start to drift to become a political decision. And we've had experience with that. The Berbice Bridge is a classic case, because the data for the Berbice Bridge said that the Berbice Bridge should never have been located where it was. But the political directorate at the time had other reasons and other views, so not only did they locate it where it was, but the infrastructural costs to actually build the foundation for the access road on the Berbice, the East Berbice side, was so significant. And I am sure the same thing is going to happen to the shore base unless we insist, one, on access to the data, so that we make sure that the decision to locate the shore base is based and driven by real economics rather than political issues. We have 3 big rivers. Demerara right now is where we have a small shore base. It's clear on the eastern side of the Demerara River it's going to be difficult to locate the shore base. As you know, container trucks driving through the capital city is just not practicable. And of course, as you might have heard, the lands on the west coast of Demerara, west bank of Demerara, have suddenly escalated in price. Half of Britain Hoop is bought by Trinidadians because everybody globally is trying to land grab. So if the government takes the decision to put the shore base in the west bank of Demerara, then the people that own land over there, of course, are going to feel they're going to get a bonanza. If they locate it in the Essequibo, it depends on where in the Essequibo it gets located. And similarly, if it's located in Berbice, it's a question of where it is located in Berbice. Crab Island, for example, was mooted very early in the discussions, and one of the problems with Crab Island, and unfortunately it embarrasses all of us nationally, is if you put the shore base at Crab Island, it's right next to the Berbice Bridge. And if you bring big vessels into the shore base, and for some reason there's a mishap, literally in seconds it will end up in the Berbice Bridge. And those of you who've done physics, the mass and weight of a big ship will literally take the entire floating bridge, up the river, or down the river, as the case may be. So again, we made a short-term political decision in our history that makes no long-term sense. So it's that kind of decision-making that we have to ensure is not repeated. And of course, shore base, as I mentioned, will become an issue. I described briefly there what the shore base is, and I mentioned that to you shortly. Now, there are 2 primary locations in Guyana where oil is located. Offshore, and Liza is 120 miles offshore. It's in 6,000 meters of water to the floor of the ocean, and then it's 18,000 meters through the floor of the ocean. That was the technology that Professor Thomas was talking about. There are literally only 2 companies in the world that can drill in 6,000 meters of water and then go 18,000 meters beneath the floor of the ocean. Exxon just happens to be one of them. And the other location for oil in Guyana is down in the Takatu Basin, where we had found oil before, but we were told that it was not in commercial quantities. And a lot of people are aware that the question of a commercial discovery and whether or not it makes sense is more a political, global political decision rather than a pure economic decision. So we're not quite sure exactly how much oil there is, but those are the 2 locations where oil is found in Guyana. Professor Thomas talked about this. Liza 1, which is the first discovery, has 1.8 billion barrels of oil. And classically, after Liza, you will note, we were told how many billion barrels they were, and then they switched from describing it in terms of barrels to start describing it in terms of feet. And one of the reasons for that is that they don't have to give you barrels, so they figure you can't calculate anymore, because 95 feet of high quality oil-bearing sandstone does not tell you the size of that actual well. It just tells you the depth of it. And therefore it's less information that we are given, so we are less able to calculate exactly the size of the find. Those are the various finds it had. After Liza, we had Payara, Snook, Turbo, Ranger, and the most recent one, of course, is Longtail. Current estimates say we have 4 billion. Woodmac, which Professor Thomas referred to, actually says that that field, this is just the Stabroek block, has about 10 billion barrels. Repsol is immediately south of where Exxon is. They are going to start drilling in Q2 next year, second quarter. And as you know, Thurlow is making money on hoping to raise enough money on the English Stock Exchange to be able to drill in 2020. Are we rich yet? I'm not sure if you can see the imagery at the bottom. And the question is, are we rich yet? And the little image at the bottom says, don't count your chickens before they hatch, because they may not turn out to be chickens. And one of the questions, what do we have to do? We have to monetize our deposits. There's no point getting fantastic figures if you don't monetize it. And monetizing it is actually bringing it down to a unit value, so you know exactly what you're dealing with. So when you start to talk about how you're going to treat with those proceeds, you actually have a realistic, predictable, certain number. We have to develop our industry in a sustainable and transparent manner, and of course we've heard a lot about the Dutch disease. What have we done so far? After 50 years of independence, we spent these are our largest projects to date. We spent $200 million in Skeldon. We know that has been an absolute complete disaster. The next largest project we had capital investment by the state, CGIA. We spent $150 million. MMA perhaps has been the most successful to date, $100 million. The largest road project, which was West Coast Demerara, recently concluded, $44 million. And of course the Berbice Bridge, which we now know can't pay for itself. They want to increase the fares, the realistic cost for crossing, if they were allowed to charge their fare, it's somewhere like $5,000 a car, which you know is just not sustainable. So from Jump Street, the Berbice Bridge as a project where it is, was not viable. So we have to keep spending money to subsidize the crossing. And if we had that information, and if we had as a people control and access to the decision-making processes when the decision was made to locate the Berbice Bridge where it was and look at the numbers, we wouldn't have ended up there. But that is our history. I know Professor has said that we would be better at managing abundance rather than managing poverty. That's one of the areas I would want to engage him on, because my alternative to that is if you can't manage 2 cents, how are you going to manage $1? Because if they are structural, if you have structural management issues in relation to how you manage your finances and manage yourself, if you can't do it for the small amounts, you're not going to see the big amounts, you're going to subsidize at the end of the day. But I'm sure that's a discussion that several papers and people who are far more qualified than me at professor's level will deal with. Now, this is generally accepted as recommended figures. LIC is low income country, MIC is medium income. We are medium income country, and the World Bank recommends that of your GDP, if you're a medium income country, you should spend 8.2% of your GDP on infrastructure. That's transport, energy, water, and ICT. Last year's capital budget allocations, those are set out there, and Guyana was spending only 4.9% of our GDP on infrastructure. So even in unacceptable standards, we are classified as medium income. We are spending half of what we should be spending on infrastructure. As you know, to get to anywhere other than Linden, the airport, the terminal to Suriname, and as far as Parika, roads in Guyana are non-existent. You cannot drive from here to Mali on a fully paved road. You certainly cannot drive from here to Lethem on a fully paved road. And that entire region, 1, 7, 8, and 9, matter of fact, every time it rains in region 9, half of the Rupununi is cut off. So we don't have the bridges, we don't have the roads, and infrastructure is an obvious place to spend the revenues from oil and gas. But of course, it's not just going to be a mass spending, it's a question of how responsible and whether we have the full capacity and the rate at which we do that. Now, how do we empower Guyana to benefit from the revenues from oil and gas? We need a national infrastructure plan, I would say up to 20 years cycle, that is agreed across the board. We need national consultation, I believe that process has started. Most importantly, we need national consensus, because you can't have at every political cycle, if there is a change, that you start changing your developmental plans. We're less than 1 million people. We need to be able to have some broad consensus on our development. Let us do it in 20 to 25 years cycles. We agree it, we can tweak it depending on who gets elected, but at least we know where we're going and how we're getting there. And once we sign off on that, we can still have hot political contests as to who implements it, but let's agree the national consensus on development. We need to transcend political cycles, because every 5 years we know the competition comes up, and at the local government level it's every 3 years, and of course we need parliamentary approval. What does the oil and gas industry, development require? Like I said to you, there are 2 companies in the world that can drill at 6,000 meters, at 18,000 meters beneath the surface of the earth, and if there are only 2 companies in the world that can do it, it means that's highly technical, extremely specialized, and even for the rest of the world, they look at Exxon as if it's some sort of superhero. So oil and gas requires very experienced and skilled labor. The good thing about Guyana is that we can't fool ourselves that we haven't, because we never had an oil industry before. There's some countries like Trinidad which feel that because they've had it for 100 years, they know how to do it, but they have not. The history has shown that they've not necessarily managed it the best way. And so all of us, like David said, all of us are starting at the same level. Nobody has an advantage. The fact that people run away and come back and they have all these so-called qualifications, it doesn't work. We don't have the history. And once you start with that admission, it means that we know that we then have to go and acquire those skills, and we have to train the next generation so that by the time they qualify and come up with their postgrad degrees, they're in a position to take over in 4 to 5 years' time going forward. It requires highly specialized equipment. And I just want to give you the example of this, and in the spirit of disclosure, I do work for quite a few of the oil companies. At 6,000 feet beneath the surface of the earth, beneath the ocean, it is dark, and nothing human can survive in that. So the entire surface of the floor of the ocean, the pressure is so significant that only machines can operate there. Those machines, you literally, there's an area perhaps as the size of Buxton in which they have to put down plant and equipment, generators, tubes, because that city has to be run by itself, remotely from up on the rig. And how they do that is they actually run it by remote operated vehicles. These are little robotic vehicles that drive between the generating plant, drive between the extraction plant where the oil comes up, the other one where they pump the gas back down. So if a screw comes slack and they pick it up above, 6,000 meters up above on the surface of the ocean, somebody has to sit down on the computer and drive that remote operation vehicle to that spot, get the spanner out, and fix it. So it's very highly specialized equipment, which we don't have, and most of the people on the planet don't actually have it. The other services where we could begin to have opportunities: catering, security, logistics, engineering, environmental maintenance, and inspection. What do we need? For us to move forward in a rational way, we need a gap analysis, both for the private sector and the public sector. There's a lot of noise in the press about the private sector, certain sections of the private sector saying, you need this and you need this for the private sector. The reality is, to have coordinated, sustained development, we need to know where the gaps are, both in the government and in the private sector, because the private sector has no history and no capacity. They spend a lot of time accusing the government of that, but they're in exactly the same position, because nobody here has ever run a rig. So when they say that the government hasn't done this and the government hasn't done that, even in the private sector, we don't have the capacity. So my proposal is we come off, all this verbal exchange that we do nationally, accusing each other in the press, and we sit down and we procure a gap analysis that will show both where the government or the state needs to build itself up and build its resources, and similarly, the opportunities that are available in the private sector. So for example, welding, to pick a mid-level. Welding, we traditionally weld in a particular way. You cannot weld for deep sea that same way. There's a certain certification process you have to go through, and the technical skills that you need as a welder must be such that if you weld something, it's got to survive the pressure at 5,000 to 6,000 feet beneath the surface of the earth. That's specialized training. Nobody here has had it, but we can identify that as an area for training for our young men and women who want to go into that trade, so that in 4 or 5 years or 3 years or however long it takes to get qualified as a specialized welder, those people will come from Guyana and we will then take over the marketplace. So for example, the argument about local content and whether or not you need to pass a law, the reality is if you pass a law now that says 50% of the engineers have to be Guyanese, what's going to happen? We don't have people who are qualified. So all that will happen is the oil company will say, fine, we will hire 50%, but that cost comes back as an expense. And I give you an actual example of what happens. In Azerbaijan, they passed a law that says, I can't remember the percentage, 60% of the people employed in the rig must be from Azerbaijan. And what happened is everybody they employed from Azerbaijan, the oil company paid them to stay home because they know they were not qualified, but the cost of paying them to stay home became an expense that got taken out at the end of the day. So when you jump into the debate about local content, you have to have the real perspective. Do you have the skills? And if you don't have the skills, are you pushing up the expenses? Because the oil company is going to say, that's not our expense. And we are not going to put people who are not qualified on the rig so that when something goes wrong and we have a real disaster, we got to pay for it. So it will pay them to pay you to stay home. But the problem is that becomes an expense to the bottom for the cost. So in the discussions that you read in the newspaper, you need to put that in context. We need a short, medium, and long-term plan about what we're going to do with the industry. And this essentially is what the gap analysis should do, which is pretty straightforward. Where are the lacunas? Who are the major stakeholders, both in public and private? And we need some short-term items that can have high impact so that the government can actually start doing something and build people's confidence in the industry. The real development in Guyana will take place in what we do with the money we get from oil. And Professor Thomas spoke about that. And the question is, what is our vision for national development in the short, medium, and long term? When Mr. Burnham was in office, we used to have a Ministry of National Development that used to actually plan the economy in long-term cycles, because unless you have a long-term cycle, you're going to continue to be subject to every little vagary that happens in international economics. We don't actually have that, but what really needs to happen is we need to have a national vision that is articulated so every Guyanese knows about it. You may disagree about it, but at least you know what it is, you know what the plan is, and you know where we are going. I see a gentleman raising a book at the back. And in that national development strategy and plan, we have to decide what our priority list is. What are we going to do first? What are the infrastructure projects we're going to do first? What are the educational projects we're going to do first? In terms of health, where are we going to spend our money first, and what is the plan over the next 10 years? Coming to the end. Empowerment of the poor at the end of the day is unlikely to happen under our present constitutional structure, and I touched on that before, because unless the poor have a real voice, not fancy words in Articles 9 and 13, but they have a real voice, i.e. the power by their vote, or the power to literally control the people that purport to represent them, unless that is in the Constitution and it's guaranteed and justiciable, it's academic. There's currently no relationship between the poor and the national decision-making apparatus, except at elections. That's once every 5 years. That's the only time you can really say to a politician, yo, you ain't really performing. And that is inadequate. And there's no incentive to empower the poor unless the poor present a threat to the status quo, which is what Professor Thomas was saying. Unless you demand that this is what has to change to make sure that even though we love you, Mr. President, if you in there, whoever replaces you in the next roster to take a place, we could remove that roster. And unless that changes, you're going to have a problem. Revitalizing the village economy. At the present moment, as I mentioned before, revitalizing the national economy is driven by the politics. People will revitalize those villages which they think are voter rich. That is not a sustainable process. We need a national process. And therefore, the local government representatives at the village level need to have greater say in what happens at the national economy. Right now, Buxton can't speak to anybody unless they're gracious enough about how oil should develop. That relationship has to change. Spoke about these priorities, the gap analysis, national framework, and the future. I am very confident about the future. The question is, what sort of future will we have? It is clear with the money that's coming, we are going to see significant changes. But you can be rich, and you can end up extremely poor. Trinidad has had 3 booms, oil booms, and it has had about 6 slumps. And just to give you an example in closing, Trinidad, when they had their first oil boom somewhere in the mid-70s, a lot of the ministers of government and the businesses that were related to the ministers of government actually owned skyscrapers in Toronto. There was a block that was owned by a man called Mr. O'Halloran, who actually was a Canadian Trinidadian, as a result of pure corruption. Of course, Trinidad developed, people would see, because the numbers are just so significant. Right now, our budget is $3.5 billion US. If we start pumping up to 600,000 to 700,000 barrels a day, then of course it's going to multiply 5 times. Imagine having 5 times more money than you have now. Sure, it looks like a lot of money, but if you don't manage it, a lot of that ends up somewhere else. And exactly what happened in Trinidad, the second the oil price dipped, the country went into absolute chaos. And to give you a perspective between Guyana's blessing and Trinidad, in its best year ever, Trinidad only pumped 73,000 barrels per day. Guyana is starting in Q1 2020 at 100,000 barrels per day. So we're starting pumping more oil than Trinidad has ever pumped in its best year. Kind of dizzying information. Trinidad, I must say, however, is primarily a gas industry rather than oil. But here's what happened. So Trinidad developed the entire the entire south of Trinidad, and they established chemical plants that used gas to develop them and all the downstream products from gas, sorry. And as a result of that, because they didn't, and Trinidad had a lot of good economists, so a lot of those companies signed contracts to provide gas at a certain price. As a matter of fact, when Prime Minister Manning was in office the first time around, he had a dream to run a pipeline from Trinidad all the way to the southern coast of the United States to supply them with gas. Because the price was good, it was favorable, and as a consequence at that time, a lot of companies entered into long-term gas contracts at a fixed price. And that's the problem with negotiation. If you go into negotiations and you have a fixed price, gas prices plummeted because the US suddenly found natural gas. They no longer needed natural gas from anywhere else in the world. The US for years has had more oil reserves than Saudi Arabia, but they just didn't use them. And when they found natural gas, that's it. The bottom went out of the market. So a lot of Trinidad companies in the gas industry now are contractually obligated to provide a certain quantity of gas at above market prices where the costs have gone up, and therefore they're running at a loss. And that entire industry in the south of Trinidad, which was a great idea 20, 25 years ago, is now in real threat of closing down completely and all the attendant jobs that depend on it. So going forward, we need a world level of high-class negotiators who will advise us on contracts so that we do not commit the next generation or even ourselves to terms that are not sustainable. It is up to us to create the framework for an equitable and sustainable development of the Republic. And I say to you, better must come. Thank you very much.